Let me begin by telling you a little bit about a biographer's method, at least this biographer's method. It involves a lot of reading and immersion in the words that are the legacy of this great man whose life I'm writing. It's also involved a fair amount of legwork and travel. I've gone to the locales to have the experiences of Jackson's environment, for he was a person who was, in everything he did, deeply biographical. And so I've been to the ruins of the Jackson family farm in Spring Creek, Pennsylvania, where he was born in 1892. The photograph on my far right is him with his girlfriend, Irene Gerhardt, fishing in the Broken Straw Creek at that location in about 1913, 14, 15, before their marriage in 1916. I've climbed Jackson Hill, which is behind the photographer who took that picture. The valley is named with landmarks that are the names of his forebears. And I actually climbed Jackson Hill shortly after his February 13th birthday, figuring, you know, summer's for wimps. Let's see what it was like in the winter. And the snow was chest deep, and the slogging was very hard, and only my 12-year-old son ahead of me saying, come on, got me to the top and the breathtaking view. I've been to Jackson's boyhood home in Frewsburg, New York, to the school, or the remnants of the school he attended. Its successor is named after him in Frewsburg, to his gravesite in Frewsburg, New York, to Jamestown, to his offices, his homes, the site of his horse farm, to Chautauqua Institution, a place that was an incredibly significant part of his educational culture, even though it lacked a lot of formal schooling. I've swum in all seasons in his beloved Chautauqua Lake. Well, not winter, because it freezes. I've been to his offices in Washington, D.C. I've been, because I once worked in the Department of Justice, in this big room, which is the Attorney General's ceremonial office. I've been to the White House, at least in a tourist capacity. I've been to the Supreme Court, which is the photograph on the far left with Jackson and his law clerks during 1950-51. That's Bill Rehnquist in the crew cut in the back row on the left-hand side as you're looking at it, and his co-clerk, George Niebank. I've been to Church House at Westminster Abbey, which is where Jackson led the successful process by which 4 allied nations in the summer of 1945 negotiated a charter creating a tribunal that became the Nuremberg process, a diplomatic feat in the wreckage of war and in the fury and power of victory that had never been accomplished before. I've been to Jackson's office and hotel in Paris, nice digs, where he would sometimes repair for continental meetings from Nuremberg. I've been to the Bohemian Grove in the Redwood Groves of California, where he spent 2 glorious weeks every summer. He was a great outdoorsman, and in addition to his native New York, he fell in love with that area. I've been to the bar associations, local and larger, that meant so much to him. Jamestown, the Association of the Bar of the City of New York, the American Bar Association Center in Chicago, which he dedicated in 1953. And I've been to this room, in the photograph on my left, the courtroom in the Palace of Justice in Nuremberg, Germany. It's humanities courtroom, thanks to the prosecuting work and vision of Jackson during 1945-1946. And I have been to Albany. I've been to the former site of Albany Law School down at State Street, right across from the park behind the Capitol. I've been to the Capitol. I've been to the courts. I've been outside the governor's residence, where Jackson spent a fair amount of time inside as a Roosevelt insider. I've been to Jackson's law student apartment building, which we'll talk about in a moment. But actually, this is the first time I've been here, by which I mean Albany Law School, which of course today is in a successor location from its 1911-12 location that Jackson knew. But more importantly and provocatively, this is the first time I've been to the home of the Robert H. Jackson Dodgeball Tournament, which I'm told was held here earlier this year. And I'm still trying to figure that one out. But I must say there's something remarkably appropriate of that, because he would be delighted. As people have already said, there was an informality, a genuineness, a call me Bob quality to Jackson that was no put on. And I'm not sure dodgeball was a concept that ever crossed his mind, but he would like the idea that law students take a break and goof a little bit and play this game, and had the sense of humor in the midst of a law review and law school culture that's naming a lot of things after him this year, to name their dodgeball tournament after him. Now, a few thank yous. Of course, I join in thanking Dean Guernsey and the faculty and colleagues and students who have been part of pulling this event together. I'd specifically mention Robert Emery, a librarian here, who's been a great help to me in my research. I thank the honored guests, beginning with the judges of the Court of Appeals, particularly Judge Graffio, for those beautiful remarks this evening. My friends Phil and Linda Neal, the Jackson family members who have really made me a member of their family, in part because I provide an incredibly useful genealogical service to them. I know everybody's fourth cousin and second wife and former address and so forth, but they have been delightful people, genuine friends, and extremely helpful in my work. I thank my friends from the Jackson Center, Greg Peterson, the president, Dale Robbins, former governor of New York, Stan Lundeen, Lieutenant Governor of New York, Stan Lundeen, who's a member of the Jackson Center board. They're all here. I thank my wife, Sarah Walzer, who lives with me and Robert Jackson. And falling in love with someone when you're in law school is going to come up again later this evening. I thank my many other friends who are here, and the students of the Law Review, particularly AJ and Noel. This is their vision and their concept. I hope I'm not talking out of school to say it actually begins in 1954. Justice Jackson died suddenly of a heart attack. And in short order, the Stanford Law Review, I think with some fingerprints of Professor Phil Neal, the Columbia Law Review, the Harvard Law Review, many other legal publications did great events and major publications. The Albany Law Review did a modest event, not inappropriate, but brief, a tribute from the trustees. And in a first conversation with AJ, when this was taking shape, he said, Albany's got to do a lot more for Jackson. And boy, have you delivered on that, both of you tonight. I have a next project for you. Now, my topic this evening is Albany. Albany in the life trajectory of Robert H. Jackson. I think of Albany as the skipped step in the Jackson story. He's often thought of on the big stages and in the big contexts where he came to make his mark in public life, the New Deal, Nuremberg, the Supreme Court. And he, of course, also is thought about as a classic American life in those real, gorgeous, rural wilderness settings where he had his birth, his boyhood, his Western New York childhood, his high schooling in Frewsburg and briefly in Jamestown, his complete lack of a college education, his legal apprentice work, his legal greatness in the private practice years, 2 decades that preceded his move to Washington in public life. But often, the skipped step is Albany, by which I mean the Albany Law School, his year here as a student, and larger, this city as a seat of state government and a seat of legal greatness that was incredibly important to Jackson at the time and informing him to be the great that he grew to become. Albany connects to Jackson because it embodies those things that Phil Neal has already briefly referred to. Logic and reason, which were his hallmarks in defining what it was about lawyering that mattered to him. Its essence in human restraint. Its practical potential to improve life. Those were the things he saw, felt called to, worked to do through the law in his life. And that's all stuff that sprang from this soil, from this school, and from this legal environment in this state. I'm delighted to focus on this skip step because Jackson and Albany, I think, is a story of great mutual benefit. For Jackson, as I'm saying, Albany was part of what was in him. Jamestown justice, which is something that Felix Frankfurter used to tweak Jackson about. They were often allies and they were dear friends, but occasionally their views would diverge, and Frankfurter, Harvard professor, great thinker, great writer, world figure, would say, you know, I'm on the right side of this and you're bogged down in Jamestown justice. Jackson took that as a compliment, but really before Jamestown justice, there was Albany justice, there was New York justice, there was the real lawyering of this state, and that's what Albany was for Jackson. Going the other way, for Albany, Jackson is yours to claim. He is truly, I'm a partisan obviously, but truly the finest in his types that this country has produced or can produce. And he did a lot more in this place than spend the night or the year. And that's what I'll talk about this evening. I'm going to talk about 4 topics. Jackson coming to the law, Jackson coming to Albany, and particularly to the Albany Law School, Jackson's returns and his almost returns to Albany, and the place of Albany understood fully in the life and the legacy of Robert Jackson. Topic 1, Robert H. Jackson comes to the law. It was simply, as he explained, always his interest. From his earliest days as a thinker, reader, talker, person, he loved ideas, he loved history, he loved argument, and the things that brought those all home as he looked at a landscape of life potentials from farming to commerce to whatever was law. Debating, oratory, and the influence of special teachers, beginning with Mary Willard, was part of what encouraged him on the law path. And Frank Mott, the influential role model who has been mentioned, under whom Jackson studied as a law apprentice for the year before and the year after, the bracket years around his Albany Law School year, was the role model that led him to the law. Frank Mott was actually somebody who Jackson's father detested. Frank Mott lived large and carried a lot of debt, didn't pay his bills. And Jackson's father, who had plenty of issues of his own, thought that was an irresponsible way to live your life. That was the mark of a bad person and a bad character. And if that's Frank Mott, and Frank Mott's a lawyer, that must be what lawyers are about. And so Jackson's father, from that face of Frank Mott on the career path, opposed his son Robert becoming a lawyer. I think it's wonderful that Justice Jackson's great-grandson, Bill Hook, is here. He's named for his grandfather, Phil Neal's friend and law school classmate, Bill Jackson. But Bill's grandfather, Bill Jackson, was named for his grandfather, William Eldred Jackson, the justice's father, the man who opposed the whole path that we celebrate tonight. So there's a wonderful irony and maybe a good second thought in how all of that has played out. Jackson's mother had a softer perspective on the law path. She kind of live and let live, wanted her boy Robert to take the path he preferred, and kind of liked Frank Mott. He was up her side of the family tree after all, and as she said, he is very nice to his mother. Over paternal opposition, following his natural calling, Robert H. Jackson comes to the law. Topic 2, Robert H. Jackson comes to Albany and the Albany Law School. Let's begin with the city. I'm trying to figure it out, and I'm not quite sure right now when he first visited. But from the way he wrote about it in That Man, it seems that it predates his time as a law student. He comes to this capital city from the other side of the state with Frank Mott, because in addition to being a lawyer, Frank Mott was a Democratic politico. He was the Chautauqua County Democratic leader, as Jackson put it, if you can call someone a leader who had so few followers. But at some point, apparently in the first months of 1911, so 6 to 8 months before Jackson enrolls in this law school, he comes with Mott to the Capitol. He's Mott's apprentice, he's Mott's underling. Jackson's own political sentiments ran the Democratic way also. And a lot of introductions and handshakes are part of that visit. And one of them is a handshake with that freshman state senator from Dutchess County, Frank Roosevelt. Frank Roosevelt at that time was 28 or 29 years old. Bob Jackson was 18 or 19 years old. Frank Roosevelt had run and won, almost accidentally, a legislative race in Republican territory. And what he had going for him was personal money, great good looks, a genial personality, and a heck of a surname, because his distant cousin on the Oyster Bay branch of the family tree, of course, was recently the former president and still beloved national figure in that November 1910 election. And it actually snowed like a Dickens in Dutchess County that election day, which depressed the farm vote, and the Poughkeepsie vote narrowly elected Roosevelt to the legislature. Jackson sees Roosevelt in action in a battle against Tammany over the selection of the United States Senator. This is before the 17th Amendment, when the legislature was the path to the U.S. Senate. And it's just an acquaintance. But from there, of course, develops this incredibly important relationship and friendship over the next 30-plus years. They knew each other when they were Frank and Robert. They, of course, later became Franklin, and then Mr. President, and FDR, and Bob. But they knew each other before any of that was foreseeable to either of them. And it gave them a depth in their bond that I think was a very important part of everything that developed later. The Albany visit And some of the political attraction of Albany is part of what brings Jackson here. But the specific choice in September of 1911 is to come to Albany Law School. What Jackson does first is rent an apartment with a couple of friends from Jamestown. Here comes your project. 267 Lark Street is still a 3-story building, and it has apartments in the 2nd and 3rd floor, and it has a Chinese restaurant on the ground floor, but it needs a plaque. And so if there's anyone here in historical commemoration Albany, I think you can expect some lobbying activity from 2 energetic and powerful people who will be working on that project starting tomorrow. Why Albany Law School? Well, Jackson, the great and beautiful writer, actually left a beautiful paragraph on this very topic. After a year in Mott's office, I decided I ought to go to a law school, not having had any college. I considered various law schools in New York State. I decided against New York City because I didn't like the city to live in. The man with the fishing pole. I considered Buffalo, which by the way was Frank Mott's alma mater, and Syracuse, but I decided on the Albany Law School for 2 reasons. Some of the leading lawyers of the community, he means Jamestown, had been Albany Law School men, and it was the seat of government. The Court of Appeals sat there. The Appellate Division sat there. The Supreme Court, the legislature, and the whole state government. I thought I would learn more that was not in the books at Albany than at any other place, and that it would be useful to me in the practice of law in my community. I borrowed the money to go to Albany Law School from John Howitt, my mother's brother, who was a rather eccentric bachelor and a firm friend. And thus he came here. He apparently received some credit for his apprentice year in Frank Mott's office, and thus entered what was a 2-year program here at Albany Law School as an upperclassman. He got in just under the wire. In 1911, the New York State Board of Regents had increased its requirements for a Bachelor of Laws degree to 3 years. And the Court of Appeals was in the process of revising its rules to require 4 years of legal study in order for those without a college education to gain admission to the bar. So Jackson deciding to go to law school isn't just spontaneous, it's well informed. He started his classes at Albany Law School, which then was located across from the Capitol, on a site that is today under the Alfred E. Smith office building, in a building that had been originally the Old Redeemer Church. And it looked like a church. It had a peak and an ecclesiastical front. As Jackson put it, the building exhibited greater piety than many of its occupants. One of the interesting tidbits to think about is that as of January 1911, Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt and their young family rented a home at 248 State Street, just a few doors down the block and across the street. As I plotted, it would be in the park area behind the Capitol today. I don't have a moment to tell you about, but my imagination doesn't have to work hard to imagine one seeing the other and maybe a second or a third handshake during those years where they're on opposite sides of State Street, one the law student, the other the state senator. Jackson finished his degree requirements in that 1 year. With apologies to Phil Neal, I must say that the lore of Jackson doing double duty seems to be incorrect. It's not quite clear what a normal course load was, but it's clear that Jackson wasn't doing twice the normal course load. He was taking what appears to be a fairly standard course load, and at the end of 2 semesters, the dean and faculty passed him on his examinations and viewed him as degree eligible. So however they did this transferring in from apprentice, that's how 2 years of legal training and 1 year of law school become enough to graduate. But more of that in a moment. Jackson did well. He did very well in law school. And it's not just his word for it that we can take. He actually saved his transcript. And I can report that at least in his first semester, his very impressive grades include a 96 in procedure, a 90 in real property, a 93 in bills and notes, a 98 in guarantee and suretyship, and, well, every transcript needs a bump, an 88 in equity. An overall average of 93, 100% attendance. That's the fall semester. He didn't save the report card from the spring semester. He did report, jot down someplace, that he got a 100, a perfect grade in his corporations class. And I'll, of course, take his word for that. In addition to his coursework, though, those reasons that brought him to Albany filled his days. And again, he put this down for us. These are Jackson's words. I watched the calendar of the New York Court of Appeals, and as I had no classes in the afternoon, my classes were all in the morning, I went to the Court of Appeals every afternoon when there was a particularly good argument. I heard the very best of the New York State Bar in their appearances before the Court of Appeals. It was a great court, and that opportunity was really one of the most important assets of the school. I did enjoy appellate work, and later came to do a great deal of it. Quite an understatement, as Judge Graffey has demonstrated. But there was not so much appellate work from our city of Jamestown. The trial work was the thing that was important. I had hopes of someday doing appellate work, of course, and was interested in how good lawyers did it, their technique, their style of arguing cases, but I didn't expect a very large appellate practice. And now the understatement. I did not foresee that I would one day be Solicitor General of the United States. Now that was the extracurricular environment, in addition to the classroom lecture environment. The academic year that Jackson spent here was also filled with stimulating events. William McKinley, of course, is an alumnus of this school, and on McKinley's birthday, what would have been his 69th in January of 1912, his law school roommate came to this school and spoke to the students about McKinley's time as an Albany law student. There were ethics lectures, including one by the Dean of the Cornell Law School in March, another by a judge of the New York State Supreme Court First Department in May, pursuant to a generous grant from an alumnus named Hubbard, who had developed one of the first legal ethics curricula in the country here at Albany Law School. And knowing Jackson's thirst for input, stimulus, knowledge, reason, I feel pretty confident that those were things he also took advantage of. But he wasn't all about work. I mentioned falling in love in law school. As family lore has it, Tom will correct me later if I butcher this a little bit, there was one day where Irene Gerhardt, a young woman from Kingston, New York, was sitting on a bench in a park, I believe probably right behind the Capitol. And in the lingo of the time, a squirrel was referred to as a bobby. And she sees a little squirrel on the ground and she says, "Come here, you little bobby." At which point, the puzzled young law student glances at the drop-dead gorgeous woman on the park bench and approaches her. And it turns out that his sidekick and classmate, a fellow named, forgotten his name, Cousin Bert, was acquainted with her and a classmate of his, and the introduction is made. And thus begins the dating relationship of Irene Gerhardt and Robert Jackson. They had a lot of ice skating dates right here in Washington Park. And to connect it to some things you've heard about earlier, one of the things you'll find in the Albany newspapers from that cold, icy, great skating winter of 1912 is great legal controversy about skating on the Sabbath. The city fathers believed that such a frivolous recreational activity on the ponds of the public parks was an inappropriate and offensive activity given the religious sensibilities of some people. And when you read Robert Jackson and Barnett talking about how no great official, high or petty, shall prescribe what shall be orthodox in matters of belief or faith, I think it has a lot to do with the flag salute, but it might have a little bit to do with the ice skating, which flourished despite the objections of those religious critics. In spring 1912, commencement came to approach, but word got out in May of a distressing situation. You see, Jackson's class wasn't all Albany men. There were actually 3 women in that class of 1912, and they were all fine students: Daisy Snook, Clara Pritchard, and Clarissa Pritchard. But somebody took note in that springtime period that Clara and Clarissa were only 20 years old. And thus, although they were in the process of satisfying their course requirements and on track to pass their exams, they weren't age eligible for the New York State Bar examination, which required you to be 21 at the time. And the dean of this school, Jane Newton Fierro, stood on a principle in enforcement of that bar position and said, "We will not confer degrees on people who are not age eligible to take the New York Bar exam." This became a matter of great press attention, I think because they were twins and girls and photogenic and so forth. And it even makes the New York Times. But guess who else is only 20? That never makes the papers. But when commencement rolls around that June, the Pritchard sisters and Robert H. Jackson do not get degrees from the Albany Law School. What they get is a diploma of graduation, which is a satisfaction of requirements certification, but not the law degree. We'll come back to that too. Topic 3, Jackson's returns and his almost returns to Albany. I'll be brief on this. Probably the most important return was to finish up the Gerhardt deal. She continued to live here and work here while he established his practice in Jamestown, and after a few years and rising success, he came back and he married her here in April of 1916, and then they settled in Jamestown. Beginning in 1918, young Jackson begins to come back to Albany to argue before the New York Court of Appeals. In a 13-year period before he goes to Washington, he does not argue an enormous quantity of Court of Appeals cases, only 7. But they spread out over those years, every other year or so. And the briefing, which I've read and Phil Neal has read, reflects that gorgeous Jackson writing and confident frame of mind that typified all of his later work. Here's an interesting tidbit you may not know. He only won 2. His record before the New York Court of Appeals in cases he personally argued is 2 and 5. These cases, the couple of wins and the handful of losses, are not landmarks. The most famous one, maybe the only one that rings a bell, is Chautauqua National Bank versus the Allegheny College. It's often taught in first-year contracts courses. It's about a bequest to the college and the effort to terminate that after the bequester's death. And Jackson is arguing that on behalf of the bank, and he loses, and the college wins. Most of his cases, and I thank Phil Neal for this, on reflection do seem to be quite client-driven. And of course, an advocate is an agent of a client who is a principal. And if the client wants to appeal and seek review in the Court of Appeals, even if the argument may not be one to bet money on, a lawyer, after the counseling, will do the advocacy. And I think some of these may be in that category. But of course, one loss is not the only measure of an advocate's skill. And we have a nice little nugget that gives you another measure of how Jackson did before the New York Court of Appeals. In February of 1930, he's nominated for membership in the American Law Institute. And the council of the American Law Institute is meeting at the City Bar in Manhattan. Jackson has been nominated by Justice Charles Sears of the Fourth Department, who was an important mentor of his. And the council is deliberating the qualifications of these proposed new ALI members. One member of the council is Judge Benjamin Nathan Cardozo. And during the membership committee discussion, they work their way down to Robert H. Jackson, Jamestown, New York. And a committee member says, "Who's Jackson? I've never heard of him." And you have to sort of have a Manhattan mindset about Jamestown, 420 miles away, to really, I think, get the disdain that was probably behind that question. And Cardozo, in his quiet voice, said, "You will in time." And I think that, beyond the one-loss record, is a measure from a master of the advocacy skill that he had seen in those Court of Appeals years. Now, Jackson's path goes a lot further than Albany and his Court of Appeals advocacy. But it always connected back, at least conceptually, to this capital city. During FDR's two-year terms as governor, of course, 1929 to 1933, Jackson becomes an increasingly significant advisor, political supporter, underling, counselor, and appointee to various commissions, and that brings Jackson back to Albany quite regularly. The most important of those is the New York State Commission on the Administration of Justice. Had members appointed by the governor and the state bar, and for a 4-year period did really quite exhaustive studies and recommendations about improving the court system of New York. This may sound familiar to others who have inherited this legacy and worked just as hard on that topic. Many, many interactions on that topic brought Jackson to Albany and to the governor's mansion. He also was involved in the campaigns, 28 and 30, and in 32, the presidential campaign. And they were run out of all kinds of places, including Manhattan, but a fair amount of that was also up here, and Jackson's part of those works. Albany then begins to crop up, and for the rest of his life crops up as a potential Jackson destination, one he never seeks and one he never realizes. But some of those are worth noting. As early as 1934, there's very serious talk among Democrats, not just in the western part of the state, but statewide, about Jackson running for the New York Court of Appeals. He doesn't seek the nomination. He never makes the race. In 1936, Herbert Lehman, dying not to be governor of New York anymore, announces that Mrs. Lehman has finally prevailed, that he's done. And the New York Times headline is, Lehman to not seek re-election, Jackson likely Democratic candidate successor. Of course, in that year, Roosevelt convinces Lehman to change his mind and he runs. And briefly, Jackson is considered as the Western New York ticket balance to run for lieutenant governor. Jackson has no interest and doesn't make that race. In 1938, the Lehman calculation is very different. For in the meantime, Lehman had broken with Franklin Roosevelt over court packing in 1937. And Roosevelt's concept has a number of interesting layers. One is that he's going to keep George Washington's tradition and go home after 2 terms. Thus, he needs to think about who his successor will be in the White House. He needs to think about the politically hostile context that the New Deal has run into and what New Dealer has the right stuff to be his successor. And he looks not very far away in his inner circle and fastens on Robert H. Jackson as that man for that time period. Roosevelt tries to orchestrate Jackson's election as governor of New York in 1938, which would have positioned him, of course, to run as the Democratic nominee for the White House in 1940. And many, many events get in the way, and none of that comes to pass, beginning with Tammany, and then the world situation, and Jackson becoming Solicitor General. And as he says later in life, what a dead-end job that would have been. Governor of New York in 1939? Thank God it didn't happen to me. Following Jackson's work at Nuremberg, Albany is also a potential destination. He frankly wasn't a happy man on the court in 1944 and 1945, and Nuremberg is a bit of a trial separation. And if he's not to return to the Supreme Court following Nuremberg, one possibility is elected office. And of course, the place he's from and the place with the big offices, either the court or the governor's office, would be Albany. He went back to the court instead. Nonetheless, Albany continued to be for him, both the law school and the city, a very special, significant place in his heart, in his allegiance, in his memories, and in his activities. And that's topic 4, the place of Albany, understood fully in the life and legacy of Jackson. I'd like to talk about this by just describing 2 visits that he makes to this law school in his adult years as an alumnus. The last one is 1951. He's a justice of the Supreme Court, has been for 10 years, minus the year at Nuremberg, and it's his final visit to the law school to receive an honorary doctorate of law degree from Union University. He's age 59, and if you look at the photographs, he's showing it. He, of course, died only 3 years later. He knew by then that he'd never be president, and that was fine. I think he even knew that he wouldn't become Chief Justice, and that was just about as fine. What he knew was that he'd done work at Nuremberg that had mattered enormously for his time and his future, and it was that project that made him comfortable to stand up and from people who mattered to him greatly accept an honor like that degree. But the more revealing occasion is 10 years earlier, June of 1941, when Jackson, Attorney General at the time, returns to Albany Law School, this time to speak at the commencement. He did not speak in 1951. And there are 3 aspects of this June 1941 visit that I'd like to tell you about. The first one is just fun. It's deeply revealing. Jackson is Attorney General. Chief Justice Hughes has just announced that he's stepping down. The headline speculation across the country is that Jackson is destined to be the next Chief Justice of the United States. The war is coming. The Army has seized munitions production facilities in California just earlier that week. Lots of big stuff. And Jackson has said yes to Dean Alexander, whose room we're in tonight. And he keeps his date to come here to give that commencement address. Jackson misses the alumni lunch because he has trouble getting out of Washington. But he gets to the Fort Orange Club in the middle of the afternoon, and he has a little time to get dressed and to relax or work or whatever before dinner and then the evening commencement. And a bunch of reporters track him down. And he welcomes him into his room at the Fort Orange Club, gives them chairs, and he reclines on the bed. So puts his feet up, leans back on a pillow, and starts talking to these reporters. This is the Attorney General of the United States. This is the imminent potential next Chief Justice of the United States. This is the guy in the midst of this 20,000 armed soldiers deployed in Southern California, etc., etc. And he fields their questions, and he brushes away all the official ones, but loves the opportunity to reminisce about his time as a law student at Albany, including 267 Lark Street. His classmate, Ed Scheiberling, who was at that point the president of the Alumni Association, is there as his host. And in the midst of this conversation, they're talking to each other and calling each other what they called each other from 1911, 1912, Ed and Bob. The only substantive national matter that Jackson sort of takes the bait on is when a reporter asks him a very hostile question about the FBI. And what Jackson says is very true to the record if you're a specialist and you've studied DOJ and FBI history. J. Edgar Hoover was doing a great job in 1941. He was actually on the side of civil liberties in a way that he later fell far from. And Jackson gives a stirring defense of his subordinate and friend, Edgar, in that interview. And then while the reporters are still in the room, Jackson pulls up his suspenders and ties his bow tie and puts on his vest and puts on his jacket and says, "Come on, fellas, I've got to get over to the alumni dinner." That's Bob Jackson. A second aspect that I'd like to touch on very briefly is part of what that ceremony was in 1941. You'll remember the Clara and Clarissa Pritchard issue from the 1912 commencement, which of course was the Robert Jackson issue too. Well, now this young man, who had not been qualified in the view of Dean Fierro to receive a degree from this school in 1912, was the Attorney General of the United States, and imminently perhaps the Chief Justice of the United States. And I'd love to see a transcript or a film or hear a tape. I don't think any of those exist. But Albany Law School makes it right. What they do is they confer, belatedly, his 1912 degree on Attorney General Jackson in that moment of 1941. And Jackson put it this way in something that he wrote privately a little bit later. This is when he was publishing something in a law review, and they wanted to know what to put in that little footnote about your educational background. He said, write it this way: Albany Law School, 1912, LLB, June 5, 1941, as of class of 1912. He then explained, the peculiar entry about Albany Law School, for your information and not for print, this is to the Cornell Law Quarterly, is that I graduated in 1912 while under 21 years of age, for which reason I was not entitled to a degree. As time cured that, the degree was awarded later on a sort of nunc-pro-tunc basis. That's the practical wisdom of Robert Jackson. The third and final thing I'd like to share from that evening in 1941 is the substance of his commencement address. Hold the moment clearly in your mind. This is June of 1941. This is before Pearl Harbor. This is before American military involvement in the European theater, except through a supply support of Great Britain, at a time when war is coming, but an isolationist country still hopes that it won't be ours to fight. And Robert Jackson talks about something that he didn't have a word for. The word would be Nuremberg. This is what he said: the reconstruction of a peacetime society, both within our country and the world, will be the test and the opportunity of the legal profession. Beginning with the early struggle for liberty, continuing in the Constitutional Convention and the contest for ratification, and exemplified in a century and a half of interpretation and application to problems of increasing range and complexity, the legal profession has supplied much of the leadership that has made our American system what it is. In no single field is this more evident than in the field of international relations. I do not know by what technique the world will try to reestablish working relationships between nations, but it is difficult to conceive of any escape from the rule of force or any method of adjusting international grievances that would not basically be a mere extension and adaptation of techniques familiar to lawyers. It may proceed by a contractual method and negotiate treaties and agreements that reestablish a basis of peace, or it may follow a more legislative procedure through setting up some representative body to work out, by political methods, a reconciliation of interests. Call that the United Nations 4 years later. Or, Jackson continued, it may proceed with some adjudicative method to take up points of controversy, some perhaps never before thought to be justiciable, and arbitrate them according to legal principles. Or it may involve a combination of some or all of these. But however the world tackles the great unfinished task of world organization, to substitute reason for force, it will take up some device in which competent men and women of our profession will have had experience, learning, and skill. Now listen to a sentence that he spoke in his opening at Nuremberg a little more than 4 years later. That 4 great nations, flushed with victory and stung with injury, stay the hand of vengeance and voluntarily submit their captive enemies to the judgment of the law is one of the most significant tributes that power has ever paid to reason. This man loved the law, and this is the place where he got it. Thank you very much.
Brief because I know everyone's hungry. So, first I'd like to thank all the speakers. It was wonderful. This was truly a labor of love, and now we're finally done, Noah. Everyone from the Jackson Center, thank you for all your support. All the law review members, it's been great. You've had to hear about me and my obsession with Justice Jackson for too long now, and now you finally pulled this night off for us. Again, I'd like to thank Noelle. I think she deserves another round of applause. We can talk about how well this night went. My parents are here all the way from Erie, Pennsylvania, which is very close to Jamestown. I'd like to thank them who have put up with me from everything from my now defunct hockey career to now, hopefully not defunct law career. And touching on my remarks that I made to Professor Barrett way back when we first spoke, this year in tribute to Justice Jackson in our first issue of the Law Review, we have compiled 12 tributes from various members of Jackson's family, various members of individuals that worked with Justice Jackson either at Nuremberg or on the court. I'd just like to mention those, and feel free to stop and see me if you'd like to subscribe. The good editor-in-chief always will push the law review. So, Harold Jackson Adams has wrote a tribute. He's Justice Jackson's nephew. Bennett Bosky, who was law clerk to Justice Reed while Justice Jackson was on the court. Brady Bryson was a member of the prosecution team at Nuremberg. Father Maurice Fuchs, who was Justice Jackson's personal bodyguard at Nuremberg. Eugene Gerhardt, as mentioned before, Justice Jackson's biographer. Henry King, a member of the prosecution team at Nuremberg. Mr. Thomas Loftus, who's here with us tonight, he's wrote a tribute and is Justice Jackson's grandson. James Marsh, who was law clerk to Justice Jackson on the court. Ms. McClay, who is here with us tonight, wrote a tribute. Professor Bernie Meltzer from the University of Chicago, who was on the prosecution team at Nuremberg. E. Barrett Prettyman, who was Justice Jackson's clerk on the Supreme Court. Richard Sonnenfeld, who was the chief interpreter at Nuremberg. And those are the individuals who have wrote wonderful tributes. I really encourage you to subscribe and find out how great those are. And with that being said, please join us in the East Foyer for a reception. Thank you.
Steve, I talked on the phone, so I'm glad to press the flesh and say hello.
he like as a personality? Stimson.
You know, he was kind of, the word I can think of at the moment, he was kind of old and dowdy. His probably the one who made the telephone call to the colonel.
Just as Jackson talked about going to a cabinet meeting, I think right after, or shortly before the war started, where they started wearing identification badges, and said he went up to Stimson and said, "You've got to have a badge that says 'Call me Harry.'" Stimson didn't think it was funny at all.
You're not much of a Call Me Harry type.
Yeah,